A midnight feast for the shadows living in the old willow tree. On the warmest nights of August, when the moon was round and bright enough to turn every leaf silver, there was an old willow tree at the edge of the village. No one knew exactly how old it was. Some said it had been standing there for 100 years. Others said it had been there long before the village had a name. Its trunk was enormous, wider than 3 people holding hands, and its branches reached down toward the earth in long, graceful curtains. During the day, children sometimes played beneath it, but at night people stayed away, because after sunset, the willow looked different. Its branches twisted together like long fingers. Its hanging leaves whispered even when there seemed to be no wind. And between the curtains of leaves, the shadows moved in ways that were difficult to explain. The villagers called them the shadows of the willow. Nobody had ever seen them clearly. Nobody knew what they were. But everyone agreed on one thing. They had been there for a very long time. Generations ago, people had whispered that the willow had hidden residents living among its oldest branches. Silent watchers, keepers of forgotten things. Little spirits of darkness and moonlight. They never spoke, they never frightened anyone deliberately, they simply watched. And because people tend to fear what they cannot understand, the villagers gradually stopped visiting the tree after dark. Except for me. I had always been curious about the willow, perhaps too curious. I had spent many evenings wondering what lived beneath those ancient branches. Were the stories true? Were there really creatures hiding in the darkness? Or were the villagers simply seeing ordinary leaves and branches through frightened eyes? Then, one August evening, I decided to find out. Not by chasing the shadows away, not by carrying a bright lantern or making loud noises, but by bringing them a gift, a midnight feast. The moon was already rising when I left my house. It was a magnificent August full moon, round and pale gold at the edges. The village behind me was quiet. Most windows were dark. A few warm squares of light remained in upstairs bedrooms. Crickets sang from the grass. Somewhere far away, an owl called once. I carried a small woven basket in both hands. Inside were the things I had carefully gathered for the willow's hidden residence. Night-blooming jasmine, nectar-filled flowers, fresh berries, and several tiny glass vials filled with dew. I walked slowly toward the old tree. With every step, the willow grew larger and darker. At first, I felt brave. Then I saw the branches. They stretched across the moon like enormous arms. The wind moved through them. The leaves whispered. Something shifted high above me. I stopped, my heart beat faster. For a moment, the old stories returned to me, silent watchers. Hidden residents, shadows that had lived in the tree for generations. I almost turned around. Then I looked again. The branches were still, the moonlight was still, and I realized something. The darkness had not changed. My way of seeing it had. During the day, the willow was simply an old tree. At night, my imagination had filled its branches with everything I could not see. Perhaps fear did not always come from what was hiding in the darkness. Perhaps sometimes it came from the stories we told ourselves about what might be there. So I took another step, then another. And finally, I stood beneath the willow. The world became very quiet. I chose a small clearing beneath the widest part of the tree. The ground there was soft with fallen leaves. Silver moss grew along the roots. The branches formed a natural ceiling overhead. I placed my basket on the earth. Then I began preparing the feast. The first offering was jasmine. The flowers were tiny and white, with delicate petals that seemed almost luminous beneath the moon. Their fragrance was stronger at night. Sweet, warm, almost honey-like. I arranged them in a shallow wooden bowl. "This is for the night," I whispered. Then came the nectar-soaked blossoms. I had gathered flowers that had spent the warm hours of the day drinking in sunlight. Now their petals were cool, but their centers still held the sweetness of nectar. I placed them carefully beside the jasmine. This is for the warmth of the day. Finally, I opened the little glass vials. Inside each one were droplets of dew. They shimmered in the moonlight, tiny worlds trapped inside glass. I had collected them from leaves just before leaving home. Each droplet carried a reflection of the sky, the earth below, the moon above, a little bridge between two worlds. I placed the vials around the flowers. "This is for the sky," I whispered. Then I stepped back. The feast was ready, but I was not finished. From my basket I took 3 small lanterns. They were not ordinary lanterns. Inside each was a gentle living glow, soft enough that it did not hurt the eyes. I placed the first beside the willow's roots, then the second, then the third. Their pale green light spread across the ground. Suddenly the silver moss began to shine. The ancient bark seemed to glow from within. Tiny droplets on the leaves reflected the lantern light. The willow was no longer a frightening silhouette. It had become something else, something older, something gentler. I sat down. I waited. Nothing happened. For several minutes there was only the sound of crickets. Then, rustle. I looked up. One branch moved. There was no wind. I held my breath. Another branch trembled, then another. The leaves whispered against one another. Shh. The sound moved through the willow like a quiet conversation. I wondered if the watchers had noticed the feast. Then I saw something, and a tiny light appeared high among the branches. It was no larger than a firefly. It hovered for a moment, then disappeared. Another light appeared, then another. Soon there were dozens. Tiny points of greenish gold light moved slowly through the branches. They did not fly like ordinary fireflies. They drifted, almost lazily, like stars that had forgotten where the sky ended. I watched without moving. The little lights gathered above the feast. One descended, then another, and slowly the shadows began to change. At first I thought something was moving between the branches. Then I realized that the shadows themselves were moving. Long shapes stretched across the bark. They curled around the branches. They shifted and disappeared. But there was nothing frightening about them now. The shadows seemed soft, almost shy. One settled beside the bowl of jasmine. Another hovered over the dew. A third rested near the blossoms. The willow had become full of quiet watchers, and I finally understood something. They were not waiting for me to leave. They were welcoming me. I had come to the tree thinking that I was an outsider, someone standing at the edge of a mystery. But sitting beneath those ancient branches, I suddenly felt something different. I felt like a guest. The willow had accepted my offering, and the darkness had accepted me. I smiled. "I don't know what you are," I whispered. The leaves moved gently above me. "But I'm glad you're here." For a moment, everything became completely still. Then one of the tiny glowing lights descended toward me. It stopped just above my hand. Warm light spilled across my fingers. I could not see what created it. I could not name it. And somehow I no longer needed to. Not everything mysterious needs to be explained. Some things can simply be noticed. Some things can simply be respected. Some things can remain unknown and still be beautiful. I stayed beneath the willow for a long time. The feast slowly disappeared. The jasmine petals curled inward. The nectar in the blossoms was gone. The dew droplets vanished from their glass vials. But I never saw exactly who had eaten them. Perhaps they were taken by tiny creatures hidden among the leaves. Perhaps they were carried away by the night air. Perhaps the old stories were true. I still don't know. But that night I learned something more important than the answer. I learned that wonder does not require certainty. Sometimes it begins with a question. What if there is more here than I can see? And instead of answering that question with fear, we can answer it with curiosity. Instead of saying, "Stay away," we can say, "Welcome." Instead of trying to conquer every darkness, perhaps we can sit quietly beside it. And listen, the willow continued whispering above me. Its branches swayed gently, the little lights moved among the leaves, and for the first time I understood why people had remembered the tree for so many generations. Perhaps the old willow had never needed protecting from the darkness. Perhaps the darkness had been part of its sanctuary all along. Eventually, the eastern sky began to brighten. The moon slowly faded. The stars became fewer. A pale blue line appeared beyond the hills. Dawn was approaching. I knew it was time to leave, so I gathered the empty bowls. I collected the lanterns, and before I stood, I placed one final flower beside the willow's oldest root. It was a small white blossom, fresh and bright. "For the watchers," I said. Then I placed my hand against the ancient bark. "Thank you for letting me stay." The tree gave a long, gentle sigh. Its leaves rustled from one end of the branches to the other. "Shh!" It sounded almost like a reply. I smiled. Then I walked home. The village looked different in the early morning. The houses were beginning to wake. Birds were calling from rooftops. Smoke curled from a distant chimney. Someone opened a window. Everything was ordinary again, but I was not quite the same, because now I knew that ordinary places could hold extraordinary mysteries. An old tree, a forgotten stone, a quiet pond, a path through the woods, a building that had stood for generations. We pass these places every day. Sometimes we forget to notice them. Sometimes we are so busy moving forward that we never stop to wonder what came before us. But perhaps wonder does not always require distant stars or enchanted kingdoms. Perhaps magic can live beneath an old willow tree. Perhaps it can hide inside the moss growing on a stone. Perhaps it can be found in the silence of a forest just before sunrise. And perhaps the best way to meet such mysteries is not with fear, but with respect, with patience, with a little kindness, and sometimes with a midnight feast. So if you know an old tree in your own neighborhood, take a moment to notice it. You don't need to leave flowers beneath it. You don't need to perform a ritual. Simply pause. Look at its branches. Listen to the leaves. Notice the way the moonlight touches its bark. Think about how many seasons it has witnessed, how many people have walked beneath it, how many storms it has survived, and how many quiet mornings it has seen. And remember that the world is full of things we do not completely understand. That does not make them frightening. It makes them mysterious. And mystery can be beautiful. Because sometimes when we stop trying to explain the darkness, we discover that it was never waiting to frighten us. It was simply waiting for us to sit down, to listen, and to wonder. So, as the last stars disappear and morning begins to bloom, the old willow remains where it has always been, its branches reaching toward the sky, its roots deep in the earth, its silent watchers hidden among the leaves. And when night returns again, perhaps the little lights will appear. Perhaps the shadows will gather, perhaps the willow will whisper, and perhaps, somewhere beneath its ancient branches, there will be another midnight feast waiting for those who are brave enough to replace fear with wonder. Until then, let the old willow sleep, let the shadows rest, and let the mysteries of the night remain exactly as they are, unseen, unexplained, and quietly magical. Good night.